Hello and good morning from London, good afternoon from Singapore, and welcome to this, the second in a series of webinars brought to you by Global Grain Geneva 2020. Thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Tim Worledge. I'm an editorial director at Fastmarkets AgriCensus, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to another information-packed hour with another stellar speaker. My thanks also go to our friends and now colleagues at Global Grain Geneva 2020 for inviting me back. Put bluntly, they needed someone to host, and I needed an excuse to wear a shirt. So if you weren't here last week, then you'll know the drill already. If you weren't here, why not? In a moment, I will invite today's speaker, Chow, Senior Vice President of Agri, Food and Beverage Sector with Mizuho Bank, to take the virtual podium. But before I do, I just want to invite and encourage everyone listening to take the opportunity to ask all of the questions that you can think of during this webinar. On the screen, you should be able to see an icon inviting you to type in your question and send it to us at any point during the presentation, and we'll be taking regular breaks throughout to address any of those questions. Now, on to today's presentation entitled The Protein Gap Outlook in the Post-COVID-19 World. It touches on everything from African swine fever through to the rise of plant-based proteins. To steer us through that wide-ranging topic, I'm very pleased to welcome someone almost uniquely qualified to lead the debate, Chow. JY's education in this field has been equally wide-ranging, making him a much sought-after presenter during normal times. His career spans hands-on experience managing the supply chain of animal nutrition group Neovia's China operations, to working as Rabobank's protein and trade finance specialist, through to his most recent role with Mizuho Bank's Asia Pacific food and beverage coverage. JY, thank you for your time, and over to you.
All right. Thank you, Tim, and great pleasure to be here. I would like to thank everyone for attending that event. I'm very happy to be here. It's a great pleasure to do that together. It's really a great pleasure to be on the virtual stage. I think within 1 hour, we have a lot of topics to cover. But first things first, I just want to give a small disclaimers. I have 2 young children confined with me. I hope not being the next BBC guy, but yes, I will try to manage that. So maybe a way to keep you interesting during that event, that something may pop in during my presentations. But well, back to the topic. It's really a pleasure to tackle that huge theme around the grain and oilseed, which is so critical to our ag community, right? I'm not trying to look at the crystal ball, definitely not. But I just want to share some outlook and thoughts of what we see in that market, right? And I really want to make it interactive. We will give you time to ask questions. I think team will monitor the questions that's coming to the panels and discussions. It's really a time for us to connect, to share some ideas and what we see during that time, right? So with further ado, let's start with the first point on what we call the fundamentals on the protein gap, right? So first, why this is so important, right? Why I'm talking about the Asia protein gap? I think the pictures that I put there, the 2 pictures, it's really setting the stage, right? You can see definitely the different arrows that coming in Asia, right? On the left, it's the oilseed market. Annually is about 380 million metric tons, which is trade worldwide. And if you look at the meat, is about 45 millions back in 2018, right? So definitely, if you look at these 2 pictures, right, what is standing out is all these arrows which is coming into Asia, right? And China is also at the center of the gravity of all these flows. And it's really about the Asian protein gap. This is the most important topic in our community again. And I think I'm really glad to tackle this. It is a driver which is so important for the trade flow, what we're talking about, but it's also involving millions of stakeholders in the soy meat value chain, right? And there's also a very strong geopolitical element around that. And finally, it's also a huge theme around the sustainability point of view as well. So it's really important to tackle that. And I hope we cover that within these 45 minutes, right? We all know that Asia is in a great deficit for the protein gap, right? So the billion-dollar questions, that is, how's the gap? Is it the gap that's going to be widening or narrowing? This is a key question that I tried to find out within the presentation today, right? So first things first, let's size this gap, right? So blankly speaking, the rough numbers, we're talking about 135 millions. That was back in 2018 with approximately the same numbers. And what's behind this number? Let me give you a bit of colors, right? So in that charts, you can see the evolutions of that protein gap from the last 20 years and plus. And the way I show it is, for me, the protein gap in Asia, it comes either from the meal perspective or the meat perspective. But at the end, it comes to the same equation, right? So that if we want to talk to the same unit, I make it more simplistic and I choose to talk about soy meal equivalent, right? So in the light blue that you can see, it's basically where I'm talking about here, the light blue here is everything about the soybean, soy meal, DDGS, and fish meal, right? They all have some different level of crude proteins, but if you put it as an equivalent of soy meal, this is the equivalent in total that is showing up, right? And of course, in the equations, you have meat as well, right? Because when you import meat in Asia, it's like you don't need to import the meal. So we need also to put the meat into that equation. So I translated the pig meat, the poultry meat, the beef, all in that equations. And so that is a bit more complex because there's some inclusion weights that you use in the feed formulas. There's a feed conversion rate. But to make it simple, I just put it in one simple chart to visualize it, right? And you can see that the massive growth in the last decades, right here, that you can see, right? It's really the growth that it was showing from the demand for meal, and it's sort of starting to plateau on the meal side, and this is where we are now. So the question is it something going up or it's going to be down? That's a key question we try to clarify here, right? Right. So that's where we're gonna. And just to clarify here, I'm talking about the net import, right? So and net the export and import, that you don't have to get confused on that, right? So on the key driver on the protein gap, definitely the first thing first is again the meat, right? So the meat consumptions is definitely one of the key drivers for the whole soy complex that we see in Asia, right? And to understand that, here I put in that chart a way to show how the meat ratio in your daily meal in terms of calorie intake, and how it is related to your GDP level, right? And you can see that very rapidly that, and what things standing out, you can see a strong correlation that meat demand, it's about affordability, right? The higher GDP levels you have, the higher meat consumption it is, right? Because you can see for each of these countries, you see the different dots, and each dots represent your meat consumptions at a certain level of GDPs at a certain year of time, right? So you can see the different evolutions that you have in some of these cases. If I take this example, right, this is China in red. You can see the drastic growth of the situations that we are happening. It was a fantastic growth. But what is interesting that it's not only about affordability, because you see some of these countries that we can see here. If the example here or here, both sort of mature countries, you see that the growth has been decelerating or even flattening, right? So what's going on, right, for those countries, right? Well, those markets have been maturing, right? This is a situation of in Japan, in Australia, in US. At some point of time, even if you can afford it, your stomach reach a limit. And that's something that we have to understand, that some of these emerging countries will also reach a plateau, right? The growth is not an unflated line that you can continue to grow, right? And I'm gonna put a spoiler here, but it's really also about aging populations. When you start aging, you will see how your consumption will evolve. Will be a quite interesting evolutions. And of course, when you talk about the meat consumptions and how the proteins is been translating for you, it's not only about economics. Of course, there's a strong cultural background about that. There's also a lot of availability of proteins, right? Different countries will have different lean into almost seafood or fish related, depending on the geography of your countries and the proximities to the resource as well, right? So this is also something that you need to take into account, of course, right? But one thing interesting that's overall in Asia, you can see two blocks of growth, right? And this is another chart, which is quite a pack of data, but you can see that I represent here the protein consumption here in terms of growth, and the animal feed demand correlation. So it's a really strong correlations, definitely, but you can see that there's definitely two blocks. You have the blocks of the developing countries where the meat demand is growing together with the feed demands, but also you can see the mature countries where there's almost no growth, right? And China is a bit in between, right? And those data was a bit sort of outdated back to 2016. So probably we're moving to that directions as well, right? So it's interesting to understand what's going on with these proteinizations, right? Definitely, we see still a momentum of growth, but seems that we see a stagnation starting in Asia, and it's driven by Northeast Asia. And when I'm talking about Northeast Asia, I'm including also China as well. And to understand how the meat patterns consumptions is related to a population's aging, what I'm gonna see to talk together of how population are aging in Asia. It could be quite interesting for you to understand, right? So let me show you that charts and see some of these interesting points there, right? So here it's the share of populations which age are above 65 years old, right? And this is the evolutions that the latest data I have from including 2019, and we can stretch the projections to 2020, right? So first things you can see that Japan by now is by far the oldest countries in terms of populations, right? 28% of the population in Japan is age above 65 years old. That means 1/3 of the population almost in Japan are seniors as citizens, right? And this is a huge gap compared to what we see in the rest of the countries in Asia, right? But here we're gonna play a maybe interesting game. You can see the trends that we see on those lines, and if you try to project where would be the situation here on 2100 years, so over 70 years from now, how's the situation will be, right? Which country will be the more senior ones? Which countries would have the largest ratio of seniors? That's interesting questions, and especially if we have in the audience people living in Asia, will be a very good question to understand in your neighborhood countries or even in your own countries, what's the situations, right? I can pause from now. Maybe you can type what's your guess, which countries are we seeing? Will be interesting to see what's a guess from the audience.
There we go. Japan is
interesting.
Yeah.
Japan, Singapore. Interesting, but we don't have the answer yet. So if someone wants to try something else. True, China will definitely increase dramatically, but because of the one-child policy, as Carol mentions, yes. But again, yeah, for those who join us on that chart, this is the charts showing the percentage of populations above 65 years old, and you can see the forecast. And my question is let our audience here guess which country would have the more highest ratio of senior citizens if you look at the projection in 2100. Africa, interesting, but I don't think Africa will be definitely old countries. There's a lot of young population. I think population will continue to stay very, very young, right? Yeah. Well, it's definitely a country in Asia. It's definitely a country in northern eastern of Asia, but it's not Japan, right? I think that's quite an interesting comment here. Indonesia, Vietnam. Yes, Katrin get it right. It's South Korea. Let's see that together. So you can see here, the first countries will be the most aged populations. If you look back in the next 80 years, will be South Korea. Unfortunately, South Korea has a big demographic challenge going forward. The birth rate as of now, the latest data as it was shown is a birth rate which is of 0.88, below 1. That means within one generation, the population of South Korea can be divided by half, basically, if you take some projections, right? Because to maintain your populations, the birth rate need to be or toward above, right, to maintain the level of the populations, right? But it's very interesting on those data that you can see where we are here. Definitely we have Japan, we have Singapore, China, and US will be aging, but not on a dramatic level. But it's interesting also to see who will be the other countries which are suffering as well. And you can see, right? Let me clear the annotation here. But Thailand will also have some challenge. Vietnam as well. So a lot of the surprising countries will have a dramatic demographic change, and that will be really an interesting change we can see on the meat consumptions, right? So of course, the rest of the populations in Southeast Asia will remain quite young populations, but if you compare how aged they will be compared to now, the demographic will be very different, right? And again, when you look at how young a country is also tell you how they consume, right? Your consumption behavior will be very different, and the way how the meat is consumed is very different, right? I'm 42 years old. My doctor started reminding me that I need to be careful on my consumption of red meat, and if I want to be there for a longer time, probably we need to be careful on some of his consumptions of meat, right? So I think that's something that's just talking to a lot of us, right? The more you age, the more you will lean toward the white meats or different options to maintain. You have either you cut in meat or you eat differently. Your protein differ, right? So if you look at these projections, definitely you will slow down the growth in meat demand. I think that's something we can foresee, and that will be a very key drivers to forecast on the meat demand. And again, the correlation of meat to feed is not direct. The correlation between meat to soy is not direct, because in the bit in between you have the feed, right? And feed and farming is a really key element to understand how this correlations is happening, right? So this is the data of the global feed consumption in 2019. You can see that China lost this first ranking due to the African swine fevers. The consumptions back in 2018 was 188 million tons. Overtake estimate at 168 million, so it's down to roughly 10%. cut of 10 million. It's in line with what I was projecting back in July, when the peak of African swine fever was in the middle of it. My estimate was about 10 to 30 million. So we end up to be at the middle. So I'm not so surprised by those numbers. But it's interesting to see how the livestock situations is having even a more faster impact on the situations of a soy demand, right? Right, so I covered the first part of it. To summarize it, I mean, meat demand in Asia will grow. Yes, we still have room for proteinizations of demand from the emerging markets, but probably this demand will be, growth will be heavily offset by overall aging populations and even a faster aging population in Northeast Asia, right? So the growth momentums, it will be very different. So we can already foresee that the decade of proteins that we just had will be very different going forwards. We may have very different growth momentums. It probably will slow down because of this aging effect. So I pause from now. I'm not sure if there's more questions before I move to the next part.
There are,
Tim,
yes.
you may have some question as well.
Yes, sir. There are a couple of questions waiting. One of the things that strikes me is that we're spending so much time thinking about COVID-19 now. Could you give us maybe a very quick update on where things are with African swine fever, because it hasn't gone away?
Yeah. I will cover a bit more in the next slides, but so definitely last year it was really a dramatic impact. We need to remember that we lost half of the populations of the swine inventories in China. Of course, the feed demand in China was not cut by half, thanks by some replacements from the market of the swine to poultry, and to some extent to some others, seafood and aquaculture was replacing it. So it was not so impacted on the feed demand and the soy, right? We're just talking about a drop above 10 million. We definitely see recoveries. We see a momentums of recoveries, but it will take time, definitely. As you know, to grow a pig, it takes 6 months. There's a shortage of genetics. I just saw a news that today France was sending one of the largest pool of genetics that ever sent to China to start replenishing the inventories. So we will definitely see the momentums, right? But the momentum will take time because not only it takes 6 months to grow a pig, but at the beginning, a piglet or a young pig, the daily consumptions in terms of feed will be much smaller than a finish or a grow out pigs. So you will see definitely a crescendo of demands from the feed demands. Hopefully will match the Chinese New Year's of 2021. So we will see the recoveries. Right? I will cover that additionally in the next part, more in detail of African swine fevers and how the COVID-19 may sort of slow down that beautiful recovery stories. And I will cover that.
Perfect. We've got a raft of questions wrapping up now. How do you see growth in plant-based protein impacting demand for meat in the next 10 years? Again, I know you've got some of this in the slides ahead, but
yeah, it's definitely on the slide ahead. It's really important topics, and I think we will have time to cover later on. So if you just let me go to the second part, and I would spend much more time also on the third part, but to already cover that part of it, yes, alternative meat proteins is definitely a new equation that you need to take into account if you look at the soy complex. Because in short, it's no more about supply and demand in the complex. It's not about how much crop you have or how much soy you have in the bags and what's the meat consumptions, right? There's a lot of new factors in between, and alternative meat is in between.
Is another question, is China an importer of US feed, and is this part of the US-China phase 1 trade agreement? That's a tricky one.
You mean feed as animal feed or the feed ingredients? That's a good question. But I can cover part because it's not really in my presentation, but yes. Back in January, there was an announcement of this 40 billion agreements between China and US for agricultures. This is a large numbers, but I don't think that it will be met for many reasons, because the situations given by the COVID obviously decelerate some of its demand. And also, if you look at the realities, on yearly basis in a normal years, I think the soybean markets in terms of consumption from China is about 20 billion US dollar, 25 billions, depending on the pricings. So I don't think that 15 billions can be covered by something else, or China suddenly buy massively amount of meat, which value-wise is much higher, but still, I don't think that this 40 billion will be covered. Or another way is the nomenclatures of what we call agricultures would change, right? If you import some levers from the US, or if you import some different products, which is sort of considered as agricultural base, or you buy an IP, or you buy a companies in the US, yes, that's maybe happening. But I would say on a normal phase, I don't think this 40 billions will be achieved within these years.
Another one, what about the rising vegan trend on the young population, which will be part of the older population in a few decades?
Yes, that's thing I will cover a little on as well. Yes, definitely the demographic change. There's a lot of story also about how the meat alternatives is changing that as well.
And a final question, which kind of skirts along the same area, is while population may get older, incomes could rise towards 2060 and 2100. Would this balance the aging population negatively for red meat consumption?
Sorry, I need to can we stay the questions?
Yeah, we
can get older. Income could rise towards 2060. Could this balance the aging population negative for red meat? Well, I think you go back to my questions that there's two things, right, on the meat consumption, right? One is about affordability. So yes, the income rise gives affordability, and it's really the case for developed markets. But we need to remember that in those developing markets, the starting base is really low, right? If you look at countries like in India or some of these small emerging countries, if you eat 5 kilos or 10 kilos of meat per year, even if you double the numbers, it's not going to change much of a country like China, where the meat consumption is about 60, 65 kilos, right? So where should we focus, right? Definitely, yes, we see a lot of double-digit growth possibly in some countries in the next 10 years for meat in developed countries. But the gravity, the weight on the overall balance sheet is driven by China. It's driven by those big countries where any slight change of percentage of numbers has a whole magnitude on how the trades are going to end up both for meat and the soy proteins.
Perfect. We've got a couple more questions, which I think hopefully are relatively quick to answer, and then we'll move on. I would like to see China consuming more poultry meat due to ASF, and we'll roll these two together. Do you foresee per capita meat consumption in India increasing substantially as well?
Yeah, so the first question, yes. What happened is, after all the several crises we see in China due to the not only the Asian swine fevers, but the blue ear disease back in 2006 or 2007. So you have all the different crises on the pork supplies, and it was a roller coaster for pricings for pork. And again, it comes to affordability and the elasticity of a meat price, right? At some point, yes, consumers switch to cheaper source of proteins, and poultry is definitely one of it. And when you change, you're not catching back to what you were before, right? And of course, food service have been also a key drivers in China. You can name those McDonald's and KFC and all those Chinese fast foods, we are offering more poultry-related meat rather than the pork-related. And this is also a key drivers of some of this changing, right? And it may go faster, that change, because the younger generations also are more keen to go toward the poultry as well.
And then a little bit on India as well, whether you foresee per capita meat consumption increasing substantially, and then we'll move on.
I think the meat consumptions, yeah, it will increase, but I don't think we will reach a level which we can see in China, right? I think for India, it's much more than just about affordability, right? There's a lot of cultural issues that I think you probably will not change that. And even if they go to a poultry consumptions, the first meat they will consume is the poultry. And poultry, in terms of feed conversion rates, the usage of feed is much lower compared to swine or beef, right? And again, when you go in India, you can talk to some of the people in the street, right? You can ask them, well, are you a non-vegetarian? If you say yes, I'm a non-vegan. And the second question is, say, how often are you eating meat? They will probably tell you, well, once or twice a week, right? And if you look at what we eat in the Western world or in China, I think for most of people I know, they don't have one single day without meat or even one single meal without meat, right? So we're way far compared to what we see in Asia. So again, you will see a change in India. It will be an interesting change, but again, the base is much lower than what you see in other countries.
Perfect. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for the questions. Keep them coming. We'll move on into the post-COVID inflection point.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Tim. And I really like the interaction that we're having now. So let me move to the second part. Now it's talking about post-COVID situations, right? And it's really related to a lot of these topics. And post-COVID response to the meat value chain, it could be an entire presentation itself, right? There's so many topics we can cover, and we don't have the time now. But if you want me to just highlight in one slide what I've foreseen for our industries, there's 5 key topics, right? One is food securities. Self-sufficiency has always been a key topic. If you look at the news, there is some issues of protectionisms, but I think you see so many disruptions that in terms of logistics, but a lot of these countries was thinking back of what's the level of self-sufficiencies, should we probably change the policies, or should we change the strategy to secure the food, right? We're really lucky that we overall in the world having in a surplus market, so it was not a shock. I would say that the shock of a COVID is more a shock from the demand side. There's a lot of disruptions. It's really a challenge. And because we don't have a supply shock, which is happening at the same time, we don't see like a crazy involvement in the pricing. But still, I think food security is a very important topic. We should not neglect that case. And I think a lot of the countries, we really strongly rely on supply from outside world. We'll probably rethink of how they can have a better strategy or a better system in place for the self-sufficiency, right? The second one, I think, is very obvious. I think we are experiencing right now, right? Because of confinements, we have a lot of disruptions on the way how we produce and we operate, and definitely digitalizations and robotizations will be a new key driver in our industries. I would say it's a really good thing. I'm not saying that our industry was not modernizing, but I would say that that shock coming from COVID will definitely be a new catalyzers. We will probably accelerate some of the movement in terms of developments. I foresee AgTech, food tech to take a bigger role together with all these Internet of Things and blockchains to move our industry to the next stage. So we see startups who continue to develop. Some of the large corporate will get more involved. We already see some corporate venture capitals from some large companies where we are taking interest on that, right? The third one, and is really about food safety and the animal health, and this is related to the nature of the crisis we're having, right? Of course, there are a lot of questions of the origins of that COVID, but there's a lot of assumption that it was a biosecurities issues in somehow. So there's probably a lot of questions on how you have to reevaluate the way we farm, way that you can avoid disease, and it's a progress that we see in the animal health sectors and the nutritions. We see more synergies, more partnerships across that, and probably some of the discoveries we're doing on the human aspect of it, of securities, will probably be useful for the animal health as well. So I think we will gain efficiencies. We will continue to produce in a more safer way, and this is a really good thing, right? The fourth one is highly related to the first topic of food security. So vertical integrations. If you are companies, you see the disruption you have on your supply, so you will look at different optionalities. I think strategic sourcings have never been so important for many of these feed players, right? If you are a producer, especially meat producers, you realize how important it is to get as close as possible to the end markets. Your route to market getting very important. So direct to customer, D2Cs, and omni channels, and obviously the e-commerce will be very important. And the last one, I think something that somehow really touched my heart is about sustainabilities. I think the environment aspect, the social aspect will be very important. We will see probably more green innovations and new form of financings around these green innovations. And let's go back to what we are talking about, the soy complex, right, post-COVID. And I would like to take this example of the African swine fevers. And it's a topic which is way beyond China. It's not really a parallel to COVID, but we can see some of the similarities and understanding some of the issues, right? So I like to, again, yes, to see as an example, right? The change and the magnitude of the impact of the African swine fever, sorry, was so big that it really has created a huge gap in some of its demand here in Asia, right? I was saying that, yes, China, the swine population was divided by half. We see a huge impact in Vietnam. Philippines get also impacted. Thailand in somehow. So yes, it was really a large disruptions, and it will really change our industries. And how it would change our industries, I think it's interesting to talk about it, and I will cover that later on. But it's interesting to see, again, from a food security standpoint, if you take the pork situation in China, how it's important, right? So if you look at what's going on from the last decades in China, China pork and supply demand have always been a headache for the government in China, right? You see this up and down, and there's a sort of a running joke that China CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, stand for the China Pork Index, right? So the most important single drivers of Consumer Price Index for China was at the end pork price. So if you want to predict how the CPI was evolving, you just look at how pork prices is evolving. And it's so obvious with volatilities and how important for stabilities of the countries, but I really believe that China will continue to look at seriously how they can ensure the self-sufficiencies for the proteins as a whole. So we had question about the swine fevers and how's the recovery. So if you look at back of the situations, so in 2019, I was making an estimate back in July, and I think my final numbers was roughly in line with what happens. Right, I was expecting a drop of 5 to 15% in terms of feed. So roughly 10 to 30 millions. We end up with 20 millions according to Alltech. But what is interesting to see is there was definitely a shift the consumption patterns, right? So definitely poultry step up, and the fact that poultry is stepping up, it creates some replacements, and some of these replacements will probably stay. I had some question earlier on what its poultry will continue to take over some share from the pork. I think the questions was really valid, and the answer is yes. I think poultry meat will continue to take a larger part in China, and also I think the similar things in Vietnam. And this is also a way that it starts to show you how important it's the correlation between the meat demand, the feed situation, because again, it's not one for one, meaning that if you replace pork consumption by poultry consumptions in terms of feeds, it's not going to translate in the same way, simply because there's what we call the feed conversion rate, right? You need roughly 3 kilos of feed to produce 1 kilo of meat, of pork meat, but for poultry is 1.8. Meaning that if you switch your meat consumptions from pork to poultry, you more or less divided your feed consumption by half. So this is an important factors, and I will again go back to that, because this is one of the key factors where changing the equations on our feed demand. I think yeah, sorry. I share, let me clear the annotation here and move to the next one, right? So that was one of the topics I was covering here, right? So one thing that we see happening because of a crisis in China of the pork industries is a lot of these backyard farmers have been moving out of the industries, right? Simply because the pressures from the disease was too high that a lot of these players cannot afford to stay in the industries, right? So the industry is moving to a more professional industry, so meaning that it will really intensify the farming landscape, meaning that in China, the farming industrializations, it's accelerating after crisis like we experienced from the African swine fevers. So because you move from backyard productions to professional farmings, you move from not using feed to commercial feed. So this is a good thing. So it sort of increase the feed demands. But on the other side, you also gain in terms of efficiencies, right? When you have a professional farming systems, mortality rates declines, so your feed conversion rate is improving, right? So this is what I'm showing on the right side of this chart. So this is really important here, right? Because again, one of the key drivers is the feed conversion rate, right? When back in 2015, when you need in China about 3.2 kilos of feed to produce 1 kilo of pork, but now with the improvement of industries, you probably need only 2.5. So this is a huge improvement, right? And these improvements is sort of offsetting all the extra demand in meat that is happening in between this decade, right? So the question is, yes, the more you improve the industries, the more efficiency you gain, the lesser feed you need, basically, right? So this is a huge impact on the soy complex. And to help you to visualize it, right? This is a sort of a way to summarize it. If you look at the meat to protein equations, right? So one simple way to look at what's the key different drivers for, let's say, different countries of what would be the gap in terms of the meal protein gap, right? In terms of soy meal equivalents, right? So one very pragmatic approach is you look at the value chain and you systematically look at backward, right? From the meat consumptions, from the livestock inventory, and look at the disease situations, the feed conversion rates, and then you obtain the proteins level, right? And of course, you need to take care of what's happening in terms of import export, because if you import export some meat, definitely it offsets some of the demand, right? But what I highlight here is really the game changer, right? What is impacting really the situation, right? As I say, if you eat pork, your feed consumptions is higher than when you eat poultry. So the more change we hear happening here, the more impact we see on the equations, right? So if you switch your meat from pork to poultry, you will reduce your feed demand by half. And subsequently, what's going to happen the same for soy. But if you do it from pork to fish, it's even faster. You're going to divide it by 3, right? So this is one of the factors you have to key in when you look at the equations of meat to protein meal equations. Right. So that was the second part. I hope I help you to size it a bit, the equations around the meal and the meat situations. I think I showed sort of a basic simplistic equations from the feed demand, the livestock, the feed conversion rate. And I would say the trends we're seeing in Asia, it's basically producing more with less, right? The farming, the feed technologies is improving. So basically, you'll be able to produce more with less feed, and meaning less soy meal, basically. So I can stop from now. If you have more questions, we can cover that. And after, I can go to the next final part.
Perfect. Thank you, JY. We certainly do have some more questions. I'll read this one for you, because it's a great opportunity for you to grab a bit of refreshment. China corn stocks are declining over the last few years, while China's wheat stocks are still climbing to record levels. Do you think this trend will continue? Is there more use for feed, optimized costs, including cheap imports, and wheat for human consumption?
Interesting, right? So you want to see what's happening between the corn and wheat situation, right? I think what happened for corn and also from wheat, but the government was putting a lot of incentives to produce and pork, so to produce the corn and the wheat. So it was really not demand driven, but sort of a subsidized driven. So we end up to have a stock reserve of corn, which is quite significant, right? And that was something that, again, is a bit related to what I'm saying, right? Because nobody was, or we were, I'm not saying nobody, but probably we were underestimated the improvement in feed conversion rate on the farming levels. And the more you improve, the less corn you need, right? So you end up to have a corn reserve, which was stockpiling, right? So, and because you have some situation on the inventory levels of swine, so of course you have some stockpiling. So that's why China was trying to make a program to into the biofuel with corn, try to clean up some of his reserve. I believe that was one of the reasons. But I also see that was planned to build up a lot of his biofuel production plants. Now it's not happening anymore. So there's a bit of a question mark of what's the level of the corn level actually.
Right. This is a question that whenever you're talking protein, here's a question that always comes up sooner or later. Do you see relevance in insects as a feed ingredient, and who in the chain do you think should lead its use for its benefits, for the benefits that it can provide?
Right. Okay. Maybe I will cover the question on the third part. I'm going into that. Yeah.
Cool. We've we've got another one here. Quite an interesting webinar. It's a bit cheeky. It's a very interesting webinar, JY. What is the reason in your what is the reason in your opinion there are so many epidemics of swine flu, avian flu, mares in the last few years, and mostly originating in China, which is sort of a loaded question. Will more sustainable practices minimize this, and can the supply keep pace with protein demand?
Well, yeah, it's the sort of difficult questions. I think epidemics in the animal productions is happening in many countries. The fact is, China is a very large country with a very large needs. So the industries have been catching up very rapidly to fulfill that demands, but obviously it was also stretched and put into stress in some situations, right? And I think definitely the biosecurities have some improvement to do. But I would say that yes, some of these crises in terms of disease around the animal productions was not only related to China. We see things happening in different parts of the world, like we see disease in Eastern Europe, in Africa. And bird flu is also happening in other countries. But the way how we pay so much attentions, again, is because China and Asia is short of proteins, right? So I would say the eyes into the disease, it matters even more because China is short of proteins, right? Every time you have a disease, it's translating to a huge vacuum of needs of proteins. Either you import meat or either you import the soy. So this is an issue that the attentions into the disease actually is driven also by the gap in the protein level.
How do you see, another nice easy one here, how do you see COVID-19 impacting meat consumption in the future?
Right. So there's a mid-terms and long terms. I think definitely in the first few months, you see a spike in livestock. The reason because there's a bit of stockpiling. Everybody was filling the fridge with frozen meat and so on, right? So slaughterhouse was working very hard. But you see also a lot of disruptions and mismatch between supply and demand, right? Because of a lot of these confinement rules, a lot of shutdowns between countries. It was not so easy, right? But the reality, I think, is a lot of these stockpilings, either at home or even some companies or some retailers putting some buffers, it's sort of masking the real demand offset. Because for me, food service, including fast food and restaurants, it's where the protein demand and protein consumption is happening more, right? And the fact that because of the whole confinements, a lot of this food service is not operating or not operating in full mode, is definitely offsetting the demand, right? And so I would say, as long as food service would be challenged to operate in a normal way, in the long run, meat demand will be offset, will be reduced, right? Again, because meat consumption is important for the food service, but also when you stay at home, you don't waste food, right? So all the food service and the production was somehow extra production which is wasted, it's not happening anymore, right? So I would say down the line, depending on some countries and the situations, as long as food service is not recovering, definitely we will see some diminution in terms of demand for protein.
Perfect. We've got one more question to go. We've got another 5 minutes. I think we'll probably overrun a little bit into the next hour if everyone's okay with that, because we have had some really, really good questions here. I'll finish up with this one, then we can move on to the next section, the final section. Who will secure the alternative protein supply chain, Northeast or Southeast Asia? I'm not sure if that's secure as in win market share or secure as in literally make it secure. But
well, questions, I think it's a really good questions. I think there's no one single solutions to fill that gap, right? And that's a good introduction to my third part, right? Asia has a protein gap. That is no doubt about it. regardless of if it's expanding or narrowing, the gap is there, right? The question is how going forward we will fill that gap, right? And you will see some alternatives. I think some of these countries, we have a large deficit of proteins. We'll probably would be more keen to look at alternatives source of proteins, not only from a strategic point of view, but I think the sustainability point of view is also very important as well.
Perfect. I think that sounds like a perfect cue to bring it home.
Right. Okay. Let me move to the last part, right? And this is the additional new factors that you have to put on your equations when you look at the meal protein gap and the meat, right? Now we have the meatless meat, right? The meat alternative markets, which is also taking some of these proteins from the mouth of the livestock industries, and I would say the the whole meat value chain, right? And this is a new disruptions, right? So we see some forecasts, we see some numbers, but of course you can wonder if those numbers, how accurate is it, because I think that market is evolving very fast. But just one thing to mention about the forecast growth, a 6 to 7% growth is probably almost double of some of its growth in terms of the traditional meat industries, right? So I don't think we can underestimate the potential of meat alternatives. I think it's getting something very important. I think it's even more, I would say, meaningful in Asia, because alternative meat in Asia has been existing for a long time, right? I mean, tofu and tempeh and all the different alternatives have been there for a while, right? Of course, there's now the westernizations of some of these diets, which are taking a lot of attentions. But I definitely see the potentials of alternative meat in Asia to continue to grow going forward, right? And that this following chart, I think, is very interesting to see what's in there, right? So why is it so interesting to look at this this alternative protein, right? There's two things I just want to highlight there, right? There's a whole new marketing approach for these new meat alternatives, right? I would say maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when we're talking about alternative meat, it was really for a niche vegan populations. But now the approach is very different. Now it is meat alternatives for meat lovers as well. So it's a very different marketing. It's a very different strategies. Myself, I've tried it. I'm a meat lovers, and I found it quite interesting as a product, right? So it's a bit like the stats. If you want to compare like Tesla, right? Some driver of Tesla, they probably would not buy the Tesla car because it is a sustainable electric car, but they will just buy the car because they love that car, they love the design, they love the product. So this is a bit the new approach that all these meatless companies are producing. They are responding to a demand, and the demand is appealing, and the product is appealing to a demand. Again, it really go back to the situation when the population start aging. You may think of having a quota of meat. Myself, I'm a meat lovers. Can I continue in a sustainable way to continue to eat red meat every day? Probably not. But can I save my quota for a good steak and maybe have an alternative meat once in a while? Maybe. So this is one interesting thing we see in the industry, right? And the second point is, it's really interesting to see who's behind some of these big companies, right? There's a lot of big names. We have been supporting these alternative meat industries, and these big names have been supporting some of them since the day one. And those are very influential, right? I take an example. I think it was Impossible Burgers or Impossible Meat at that time. Some of these investors are also sitting on the board of some retailers. And some of these players, some of these investors were so influential that they were able to talk to the retailers that my impossible meats that I've been investing in, I don't want to be in the next to tofu corners. I want to be exposed and proposed as a meat alternatives at the butcher counters. So this is what we see of the new development of these alternative meats in the last 5 years. And I think going forward, the developments will be even more interesting. And I think the next slide is even more interesting to talk about it, because the food alternative protein market is already a game changer in our industry, right? It's already a tangible industry, right? You can see on the top of a slide, within just less than 2 years, right? You can see the number of players that was, sorry, again, I get confused on the ticking numbers. You can see, right? It was probably, yeah, about 20 players around the industries, but within less than two years, I think we even cannot count the number of players, or the whole ecosystem have been changed, right? And this is a really nice chart that was done by New Proteins. I invite you to have a look at that. It's very interesting. And you get two interesting example as well. I mean, Beyond Meat, this IPO was a biggest popping US IPO stories since 20 years. So it's very interesting. And last is Dean Foods filing for bankruptcy, the largest dairy players in the US, right? Obviously, it was not only about alternative dairy, but I think alternative dairy is, again, was taking some of the volumes away from them and make them in the situation more challenging for them. And I think we have questions about the insect proteins and alternative feed, right? So again, alternative meats is one thing that will also offset some of the soy complex demand. And the new solutions for alternative protein will also be a new disruptions, right? So we can talk about insect proteins, algae, single cell proteins, and we see even more solutions coming up, right? There's a company called Insects, is a French-based company. They did one of the largest Series C's fundraising. They are building a farm. They're building a processing. So they already have some committed volumes. I heard from some animal feed players. So this is a really tangible business. And I think there's a questions about where I see insect proteins going forward. And I see the questions behind, which is about scalability, right? Today, insect proteins, it's a very tiny volume. If you look at the volume it takes from the whole soy proteins, right? But I would say it's not a volume game for the insect proteins. It's a bit more complex than that. I think the insect proteins has not only nutritional value regarding the crude proteins, but there's also some nutritional values around the fatty acids, the amino acids, the vitamins that is including. So this is another way to look at in your formula for feed, and it's very interesting to see how it will use, right? And again, because of scalability, it will probably not start by being a feed proteins alternative for large-scale feed productions, right? If you took to our feed millers, probably insect protein players can deliver maybe 10 or 50,000 tons. So it's probably not enough for feed millers. We are probably meeting millions of tons per year. So it probably not interesting at that level, but there's a lot of potential to start with pet foods and aqua feeds to start with. And I think this is really the beginning of our industries. They will improve the scalabilities, they will improve the efficiencies. And the first way to start the business is definitely from the pet food industries and the aquafeed industries, right? Single cell protein is quite an interesting product. Just for your information, the single cell proteins, it's used from fermenting methane consuming microbes with the natural gas. So basically, it's carbon neutral solutions. So there's very interesting. So there's one company, US based called Calista. There's just signed a joint ventures in China with AgriCensus, which is one of the largest additive players in the world. So we see very interesting tangible developments in that space. So I think the proteins sort of portfolio will be even more complex going forward. This is almost my last slide. I think this is a nice way to visualize it. So I was showing the basics in terms of the meal proteins. And again, if I put some annotations for different colors. So you have the traditional industries where it starts from the meat demands, what's happening in the farming, the feed conversion rate, and you go down to your consumption for the soy meal, right? But now the industry is more complex than that. You have some plant-based, cell-based solutions, which basically when you eat 1 kilo of these alternative meats, you almost don't consume any feed. You don't consume any feeds. You don't consume some soybean or very little, but you probably use more pearls and different sort of ingredients, right? And another new interesting shortcut is all these new alternative protein for the feed industries, right? As I just mentioned, the insect, algae, and single cells. So the alternative source of proteins, it will be a new disruptions, right? And so some of these key drivers will be very interesting to follow. I think this the equation is getting more complex. So that's why if you ask me right numbers is very difficult to say, but it's definitely seeing that we start having an answer of where the protein gap in Asia will look like, right? Let me clear a chart. So this is my conclusion slide. So yes, the Asia protein gap is closing up. This is what I've foreseen. And it may be closing up faster than we think. And again, why we think it's closing up faster is because although I see room for growth for protein demand in developing Asia, but the key demand which is coming from China, it's slowing down and maybe decelerating because China and some of these northeastern Asia countries are aging, and the aging populations will definitely have impact demands and erode consumption of meat, which is driving the demands from that, right? And again, the post-COVID, I think, is an inflection point. I think self-sufficiencies, the theme of production more with less was already there, but I think it will be even more critical going forward. And I think the industry will also move to continue to gain efficiencies on the feed conversion rate as well, right? And the last one, I think these new proteins, I call it the new protein decades. I think it's really very interesting to see how what we call the livestock-free protein base and the alternative protein meal, we have an exponential effect to narrow the gap, right? Because again, when you replace 1 kilo of your traditional pork meat from an alternative meat proteins, it's not translating on 1 kilo of meal, which is losing, but maybe even more. So very, very interesting to look at how the complex of this protein gap will continue to evolve. I stop for now, and thanks for following me so well. Unfortunately, my kids did not happen to be here, so I'm sorry to disappoint you.
No, Joe, well, that was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. I'll give you a chance to quickly grab some a drink. Just to say, we will be doing one of these again on Thursday, I think. The subject will be about ethanol, which, you know, talking roller coasters, if you've been an ethanol producer in the last few months, then you have been on quite a roller coaster. So we have, that will be at a later time though, because we will be welcoming someone from the US to help guide us through some of the nuances of what has happened to US ethanol particularly. We've got a whole stack of questions here, but JY, thank you so much. Your ability to sit still for over an hour has been phenomenal. So thank you for that. The camera has really appreciated that. The imparting of an awful lot of knowledge, plenty of questions been stimulated as well. And thank you so much to your very patient family who've been absolute superstars in the background. We have got 5 or 6 questions, which we will rattle through. Do you think that the biosecurities issues in meat consumption, highlighted by events like COVID, and increasing questions regarding sustainability would encourage a shift towards alternative meat consumption?
Yes, I think it will happen. I think some trends was already there. I think especially I would say the younger populations, the millennials, I would say they have a very specific rapport with food, but it's a bit different from I would say our generation, right? I think they grow up with most of the time not making this connection between the meat and the animals, and now understanding that the whole COVID situations and what's happening is probably maybe changing some of his demand, right? To give an example. Is but almost 20 years ago when there's a mad cow disease situations, that has some impact on how some of his market in UK or in France, some of his consumers decided not to consume beef and they never returned to that. So how this can translate into the post-COVID, there's still question marks. But yes, I think it could be a sort of catalyzers again for increasing demand for alternative protein.
And on that topic, following on, what type of grains or pulses do you see most in demand for meat imitation products, and why?
Well, I think the formulation is still evolving, but I think there's a lot of lentils and peas and pulse which is used. I think the formulations is still evolving. I think one aspect is also interesting how the vegetables, fat will play a role as well, right? Because when you want to have a good imitations of your meat, you probably need to put back some fat, and the fat need to be a vegetable fat. So you probably need to find some new formulations. I don't have a secret recipe for that, but I think yes, the market for all these alternative source will grow definitely going forward.
The biggest hurdle, what's the biggest hurdle for single cell proteins to take off?
I think this first things would be about the regulatory environment. I think how this single cell protein source will be approved for usage on feed and approved going forward to be used on the food channel downward will be probably the first channels. I think that type of industry probably quite capital intensive, so they will probably need the resource to capitals. But also, I think very pragmatic things is those facilities and factories need to get out of the ground. I think they need to prove in the market how tangible and how sustainable this solution is before giving a mainstream.
Following up that sort of technical question around, what is the protein level of insect protein, and what sort of price indications do you how does it price related to standard proteins?
Okay, that's quite a technical question. If I remember well, the protein level of some insect, depending on the meal, but I think it's lower than the fish meal, because a lot of its insect protein is compared to fish meal. I think we're talking about 55% of crude proteins. But again, it's not a one-for-one. I think if you are a feed formulation specialist, you should value some of these of the nutritional aspects of insect for these oligoelements, some of these amino acids, some of these vitamins, which also allow you to offset some of these additive that you used to put in the feed, right? So it's not a single comparisons. In the same way that you cannot compare soy meal to fish meal one for one, you have to readjust your formula. But I think what I understand from people from the industries, they make some trial, and they agree that insect proteins has a role going forward in the feed markets. The
Yeah,
problem
I think.
is, sorry,
Sorry, go on.
the problem is the scalability, right? I think of today, nobody can deliver enough volumes for large scales of demand for a single feed millers.
But there's another question. I think you mentioned dog foods as well, perhaps. The question is it limited to aqua use only? But I guess not.
No, it's not. I think, again, go for regulations, if you go for acceptance from consumers. But I had a very interesting discussion, right? If you a pet food owner, right, and yourself are vegan, you may think that it could be interesting to buy some pet food which is using insect proteins, which is probably a whole formula, not using slaughter meat, right? So there's a lot of concept behind, but probably it will be interesting, a marketing concept that could be appealing to some of his consumers.
Thank you. It's a great question here. I suspect the answer is it's going to be a relatively niche influence, but compared with the past, newborns are prone to have more animal food tolerances. Do you think this situation will increase the demand for meat alternatives?
That's a question that I don't know.
Fair enough.
I think, yeah, it's simply some maybe a more a bit difficult question for me. Sorry about that.
No, it's no problem at all. After an hour and 15 minutes, hour and 20 minutes, I think it's you've done magnificently. How do you view GMO playing to improve sustainability, carbon credits, and self-sufficiency?
It's a good question. I think GMO. There's a lot of debate about GMO. I think it's a lot of science and perceptions around that. So I think GMO as today it is a solution to solve some of his biggest anger problem we have in the world, right? If we're not using GMO, I think some of his price of commodities will be much higher, and some of his countries will really suffer to be able to feed the population. So I think it's more complex questions for that. And for a carbon footprint standpoint, yes, if you are able to improve the genetics, improve the yields, yes, at the end, you go back to the point that you manage to produce more with less.
Last couple of questions here. Great webinar this one starts, so I echo that entirely. In Asia, consumer-driven demand for sustainably fed animals appears lower than in other places in the world, for example, the EU or the USA. Do you agree? There's a second part of this, but I'll let you answer that one first.
Consumer demand for sustainably fed animal is lower. Yeah, I mean, yes, I think we need to keep in mind that Asia has been changed so fast. Given the last 20 decades that I've been here, and you need to keep in mind that Asia have been leapfrogging very rapidly, right? So are we not surprised that Asia can catch up even faster in terms of sustainability that we can see in Europe and US? There's a lot of technologies that now we have in Asia that is not happening in EU and US. So I think some mindset things can change very fast in Asia.
And the second part of the question was, shall other actors in the value chain drive the demand for alternatives? Governments through specific policies, or food and feed industries, education first, or something else?
Well, I think it's really a supply-demand solutions, right? I think alternative proteins are filling some of the demands and some of the demand have been met. So there's a market for that. If government should play a role, I think yes, in somehow I think government need to understand the whole complexity of alternative proteins. Should we push for that or not allow that? I don't think so. I think the market should be understand. I think there's a lot of educational process around that, but it's true that government can also play a role to really truly assess how strategic it is for your country, and what was the impact in terms of sustainability is true.
Getting to the last couple, how do you see consumption patterns of insects evolving in the future? I suspect that's the eating of insects rather than the eating habits of the insects themselves. And what share in total meat consumption are we likely to see by, say, 2030? I suspect probably not hugely different, but.
Yeah, for me, I don't think the insect protein as human consumption will be mainstream. I don't think the bug burger will be a big buzz, but I think the insects as a solution around the feed industry will be probably more prominent.
And we'll take this. There's a question on culture as well and how that might affect insect meat consumption. But I think you touched on the cultural influences of food patterns earlier. Is there anything particular about insects that might be play into a cultural?
Well, I mean, in Asia, insects have been consumed in different levels. I think there's a level of acceptance, but I think, again, I don't see insect as a mainstream solutions for meat consumptions. I think that there's more potential for the feed as I see now.
Yeah. I'm going to take this as the last one. What will be the biggest challenge? It's just one has just popped in and said, great webinar, very interesting, thank you. So I'll pass that on to you, JY. What will be the biggest challenge in having a sustainable protein supply chain?
Biggest challenge? I would say that the industry is still a young industry. So as any young industries, you have to prove yourself. You have to get access to capitals and so on and so on. But I think, yes, there's a lot of educational process around that. But I would say this is a minor challenge. I think the key thing is staying relevant to industries. This is probably a real challenge because I think our protein industries continue to change. I think there's more pressure around sustainabilities, and I understand why. So yes, there's room for them to improve, and one of the key challenges is to scale up, I would say.
Perfect. JY, you've given us enough of your time. Thank you very, very much indeed for that. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone for listening in as well, and thank you for the flow of questions. We've had a very healthy, interactive debate here, and I really appreciate that. Join us again. We will be staging another one of these next week on Thursday, so do look out for links to register for that. And thank you again. Good night.
Right. Thank you very much.